we just finished talking about other palettes in Photoshop. Now I saved the best for last because the pen tool itself is a tool that most people are afraid of using for the first time. And I don't blame them, it's a tool that I didn't like using for the longest time either. Until I figured out a way to make it as simple as possible to use, I was really afraid of doing it. Because again, there's multiple ways of actually doing this, just like Photoshop itself. But if you understand a few simple steps, with just 1 or 2 keys, you'd be able to do anything you want with the pen tool and make as many complex shapes as you want. Now the pen tool itself is located under this blur option or the blur tool, and it is going to be right here. Now if you're a single column, you'll see where the location is. If you're expanded column, you'll see where the location is. If you can't find it, hold down the icon and you'll see it. We want the original pen tool itself. The pen tool itself is used for making really fine selections. Say you're working with jewelry or automotive, you want to do a really nice cutout and composite of clean lines. This is the place to do it. The way this works is very interesting because the pen tool itself is very non-destructive. It has its own little section in Photoshop. The first thing we must do is select the pen tool. Then under Window, we will open up a palette called Paths. Now under Paths, it has its own layers. So for instance, we'll come down here and click New Path. This will be where our first outline is going to reside. The first example is going to be really straightforward to give you a demonstration of how it works. Let's say I want to make a square. I will take my pen tool, come over my canvas, and I will click to make my first point. Once that point is made, you may or may not see a line coming out of my cursor just as you are now. This is like a preview, kind of like what Clone Source is to the clone brush. You want to come over to this gear icon and click on rubber band. Without it, it doesn't display anything. With it, it displays exactly the area or the selection that it's going to make, or the path that it's going to create. Once you have that selected, you can come in and add another point. And you can add another point. And one more. And finally, if you want to connect the path and make it complete, you simply need to hover over it till it has the O icon next to the pen path. And there you go, you're done. You've made your first path. Isn't that exciting? You actually have something you can use. So what do we do with this? What's the point of actually making this? Well, quite simply enough, you can use this to then make selections like a cookie cutter. It is actually making a cookie cutter. Let's say I want to actually use this. There's a couple of ways that we can use this pen tool. First, before anything, make sure before making a path that you have path checked. If something else happened in this process, you might have been on shape and you might have created a block accidentally. So go back and make sure path is enabled, and that way you have the same settings that I do. Now, once you have your path made, you can go down to your path section, right click anywhere aside from the thumbnail. So you need to be either on the name or within the same row. And you can say make selection. And it asks you, do you want a soft selection or hard selection? I'll show you the difference between both. Say I keep it to the base setting. I'll say OK. And it then makes this horizontal marching ants, which then you can do anything you want with it. For instance, I can create a new layer, and then I can take my regular paintbrush and fill it in with the color that I want. And to deselect this, just hit Command D or select and deselect. So you can see here with this layer, I have filled it in with the exact shape that I made with my pen path. The other thing you could do with the selection is instead of starting out, we'll click on this path again and we'll say make selection. We'll say OK. And then we'll click on an adjustment layer like curves. And so then it actually makes this curve adjustment layer with a mask that resembles our pen path. So you can create a mask with the pen tool and then adjust different adjustment layers. The reason why it made it automatically was because I first made a selection and then added the adjustment layer. If I do the inverse, let's say that I have an adjustment layer, like a curve, and then I want to add the selection to the mask, I can then go back to my path, hit Fill Path, and say Contents Black, and OK. So you notice the inverse happened, where I actually have a white mask with a black filled in area. So everything else got brighter except the place where the mask was black. And since you understand how masks work now, you understand why this is happening. We can also click on the mask itself, hit Command I, and it inverts it, so that now anything I do to the curve only happens within that area. So those are two ways of using a selection from a path to apply with a mask or adjustment layer. Now let's say that you have a path selected on the image and you don't want that path visible anymore. All you need to do is hold Command and click on that path itself, and it becomes hidden. It doesn't have an eye like the layers does, but you just need to hold Command and click on it. Or you can click on New Path, and the second path becomes highlighted. Because there's nothing in there, it's not going to show anything on top of your PSD. Okay, so that's great. That's basically how to use it. Now, did you remember in the settings, earlier, we had that radius set to 0. So I'm going to delete this option really quick. And I'm going to try and delete my curve. But if you notice, while I have my curve adjustment layer selected and then I hit delete, it doesn't delete the curve, it deletes the path. The reason for that is Photoshop puts precedence on the path being selected first. So you can't hit delete on any of these layers at the moment. What you need to do is make sure none of these paths are selected by hitting Command or Control and making sure no path is highlighted. Then you can hit delete on the curve and it goes away. Now I'll come back to the path we made first. I will ensure that the pen tool is selected, because if I have another tool selected and then try to right click over the path, it won't necessarily work. So again, keep your tool selected that you're using for the job. So I can either right click over here or right click here and make selection. Either of them will do the same thing. I'll make selection, but this time I'll say, let's feather the radius to 3. I'll hit OK. So it makes the same selection that we're used to, except now, anytime we make an adjustment, it's going to be much softer. And I know this because I'm going to go in and take a look by hitting Option and clicking on the mask. You can see the edges of the square, or the really weird looking square that I made, seems to be smoother and softer. What's the purpose of this? Well, let's say you're shooting a subject and the edges of the person are out of focus. You can feather the radius of the selection so that when you do a pen tool path, it's not perfectly cut out. There's a little bit of softness to it, and you can add some realism. So I'll escape this view by going into my curve. Keep in mind that any shortcut we do now has been explained previously. So I won't be going over them again necessarily for every step that I do, but you can revisit any chapter that you want to cover any of those shortcuts. So I'll go ahead and hit delete on the curve. Now we have a path here. What else can we do? What other advanced settings can we use for the pen tool? Well, we've covered what we can do with it, which is actually, I think, the hardest part of it. Now, how can we make complex patterns? Well, I'm going to show you. I'll go ahead and delete that path. since this new one is empty, I'll create that. Well, you already know how to make a square. We have these 4 points, and clearly my square making skills aren't the best. However, you get the idea. Let's say we want to add some curvature to our points. Let's say we want to change it from a square to something that's more oval. Now, with the pen tool still selected, there's a few things we can do. If we hover over some of these lines, you'll notice that without clicking on anything, it changes icons. If you hover over something in between, it has a plus sign, meaning you can add more points in between. Or I can simply undo that, just with our undo commands. Now, if I come to a point here and hover over it, I can delete a point. So that's how you delete and add points without clicking anything. What if I want to change the curvature like we talked about? Well, with my pen tool, as I hover over any point, I can hold the Alt or Option, and it changes this icon into an angle when I'm hovering over any specific point. Now when I click on it and drag it outwards, it creates this diamond, baseball diamond. Well, terrible looking baseball diamond, but it creates something that looks very similar. This is amazing because now it allows me to create curvature on subjects. There's also a really interesting feature. If I simply hover over the endpoints, it doesn't allow me to do anything unless I hold the Command key and then click on the points. I can then drag and change the curvature accordingly. But at this time, it doesn't do it in proportion. You can see I can drag one endpoint much longer and further away than the other one, so it doesn't go to scale. On the horizontal line though, it matches itself on one side or another, which is a good thing. And I could do the same thing on the other side with the Command key. I can move it and change the depth or the pitch of that curve. So I can make curves that are very specialized while still retaining that same nice curvature here without being broken or bent. Now if I want to reset it, I simply hover over the point again, hit Alt or Option, and then just click on it. And it takes away that curvature. This is also the way to reset that curvature if you want things to be proportionate both horizontally and in distance. So you can see both the ends are being tilted. And like we talked about, if I want just one end to be further away, I can hold the Command key and it changes over to this white arrow. Oops. If I hold the Command key and simply click on the path again, it brings up all the points again. And then I can pull it out. And I hold Alt or Option, click on a point, and it deletes it. Let's say that we extend a curve, but we want this side to be bent in another way. Well, that's actually pretty easy to do as well. Because as you know, when we hit Command and move a point, it moves the other one as well horizontally on that same axis. But if we hit Option, we can move just one part. But you have to keep Option held down. Any of these commands, you have to make sure they're being kept held down as you are working on moving this point. So try it out and make sure you get a hang of this. And the same goes for the other end. Holding Option or Alt, clicking on that point and dragging it allows you to make specialty curves. And if I want to reset it, same thing, hold Alt or Option and then click on the point itself. So that's how you alter a path and create points. Another thing that we can do is instead of creating curves after the fact, we can create curves as we are making our path. So I'll put a new path down, put the pen tool. Now, instead of just clicking, this next step is I'm going to click and then drag. As you can see, it starts making that path immediately. So the next side, you notice that it creates that bend for the next point that I add. The larger the horizontal line is, the longer it's going to be. If I decide that it's too long, I'll simply undo and do it again. Then I can click, or I can make a point and drag and do anything that I please. Now that we've made our path, we can then alter it by using the same commands. So even that area that we just connected from start to end, we can make into a nice little curve. We can also move these points. If all these points are black, it means that the entire path is going to move. We just want one point being completely black with the rest being transparent. The way we do that is when we hit Command to bring up the white arrow, we can click outside the path, and then when we click the path again, they're all transparent. So any path point that I click on will now have that concrete anchor that we can move around. So again, the Command key and the Alt or Option key are the keys to pretty much anything that you want to do with your pen tool. Now let's do a quick realistic example where we would use this. Let's pretend we had an instruction to select one of these glasses. Let's say we wanted to select this lens right here because they wanted to make it a different color. Well, it's fairly simple. We can start by adding a point, and keep in mind, because now that you know how to add points and change them later, they don't have to be very precise. You can make it something similar and then alter it later. Also, the command plus or minus view in zoom still works without affecting what's happening with your pen tool. And the spacebar still works to move around the canvas. So the next point, I'm going to click here. If you notice that the path isn't perfect, and that's okay because like I said, we're going to be able to alter it later. So I made a quick little point, and I point, and a point, and a point. So you can make angles and shapes. So I'll do another one here. So this rubber band feature is actually quite helpful because it gives you an idea of how much the pen tool is going to curve when you add the next point. And here we go. So we have a really nice curve coming up. And in this section, we seem to be running into a little problem. If your pen tool somehow stops, you can simply drag over to the last point that you're with, and it has that little square icon. It ends up connecting that path you're working on. You can also undo and then redo a path again. So it makes it really versatile to work on. Then once you get the hang of this, it becomes much easier to visualize how much of a bend you want. So there we go, we made our path with just a few points. Now that we've done that, we can then alter our points. I will select one of these points and move them over. I will then change the curve. And the same thing goes for this last one. I will select that point first with the command key or the control key, and then I'll come to this point here at the end because I don't want to adjust my entire curve, just this leg of that point. Now I'll go look around, double check everything is good. This one might need a little bit of help. So again, I'll just extend this part of the curve bigger because it needed a bigger arch. And the rest seem pretty decent, except this one. I thought we were almost done. Okay, I'll take that path, give it more of an arch. This is why being able to edit ends of every arch is valuable. All right, there we go, beautiful. We have a nice path. Since we do, we'll come over here, right click, make selection. I'm going to feather the selection because I noticed that the lens itself seems a bit feathered into the glass. So I'll say maybe 2. Then with the selection active, I'll go to my curve. And now when I brighten or darken it, you can see that it changes. I can then even go into this red channel, change how red or green it is. Or I can even go into solid color, hit OK, and oh yeah, I need my selection, so I'll go in, make selection, and with selection active, I can also click on the mask, take black, and it made a selection of my lens. So I'll just hit Command I on the mask, change this to color, and then I can change any color that I want. Or I can start with making a selection and then adding something else. Let's say that I decide to start, let's actually make a quicker way of doing this. Let's pretend that I start with a black mask. Let's say I do levels. I'll hit Command I, or we can go under adjustment layers. And with this mask selected, then I can make a selection, or I can fill path. And I'll fill path with white. And what that does, like we mentioned before, is it just gives us a nice mask with minimal effort. And then I can make my levels adjustments. So no matter if you do it this way, like we did with the color fill, or with the levels, they both give you the same end result. So there you have it. That gives you an overview of how to work the pen tool to make selections of any kind if you work with objects you either want to extract or change the properties of. Next, we're going to be diving into the other tools you can use in Photoshop.